Today we are going to give you a very insightful idea about one of the new areas of social sciences, arts studies. So today you are going to know one of the global new expert in new areas of social sciences and arts, that is critical masculinity studies. Recently, who come from UK, he is Reader Dr. Chris Haywood from Newcastle University, and he's one of the experts in masculinity studies, sex research, gender, and lots more. Also, recently, he's the president American Men's Studies Association, and he has up to now written a number of books on critical masculinity, cultural studies, sex research, gender, different new areas in which explore what we can't see in our physical societies. Also, he has a great desire of developing our Sri Lankan education through his new researches as being appointed as the President American Men's Studies Association. Chris Haywood is a great asset to develop our country's social sciences and arts education. Today we invite Chris Haywood to our Vidulakara TV channel. Hello, Chris Haywood. How are you?
Hello, Manoj. I'm very well, thank you.
Are you enjoying Sri Lanka?
Oh, I love Sri Lanka. I love it. I love the weather. I love the food and the people. The people are lovely.
Okay. What tend to come to Sri Lanka? Why you come to Sri Lanka?
Well, one of the reasons for coming to Sri Lanka was to have you, of course, as one of my PhD students, and you gave me such good insights into the culture, into the way in which social relations takes place within Sri Lanka. It was very intriguing, and part of working with you gave me the inspiration, the desire to actually come and do something for Sri Lanka. You gave me so much, I want to give it back.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, it was my guru. He's my PhD supervisor at Newcastle University. We are doing research on Facebook, same-sex relationships, and Sri Lankan rural young man, 18 to 24. But Chris is more expert and more broad in his studies. Actually, what is, Chris, your areas of studies in broader?
Well, in a broad sense, historically, throughout my career, I've looked at young men and schooling. I've looked at men and unemployment. I've looked at men and disability, the intersection between ethnicity, gender, and ethnic minority groups. I've looked at dating. I've looked at various forms of education, and I've looked at issues around intimacy, sexual practices, and leisure. It's such a wide area that I've covered, and so I have an interest generally in things around gender and masculinity.
Interesting. Yeah. But we see that in the Newcastle University, your web portal, you are named as reader in critical masculinity studies. Actually, what is it? What does it mean by critical masculinity studies?
Well, I think historically, when we talked about gender, there was only one gender, and that was women.
Yeah.
So women have always been associated with gender. Maybe 20 years ago, I would pick up a textbook and I would look in the index and say, look at gender, and it would have women's experiences. It was if gender just applied to women and that men didn't have a gender. So part of critical masculinity studies is to explore and develop understandings to say, well, these men themselves, what they practice, their identities, the way they see the world is also gendered. So to open up notions of gender to men. Now the critical part is not just to say, talk about men as real men or strong men, but to question why that is the case. Why do we look at men, boys, in a particular way? Why do we say boys will be boys? Where does that come from? And so critical masculinity studies is about trying to understand how we see the world, how we see men and women.
That's very important. Actually, in Sri Lanka and more or less it's a bit popular, the gender studies and feminism of the studies, but it's a dearth of sexual research in terms of critical cultural studies. In that case, we see that you have number of top journal papers in Rutledge, Sage, Taylor and Francis, Springer and Macmillan, and annually Chris Haywood at least 2 books per year and number of research. He's so busy. I think last week he was in Canada and 2 weeks before he's in the States or Germany, or he's a very good ethnographic research. Actually, Chris, it's not like the global north. This is global south, Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
What is your planning, or how you contribute your scientific evidences or scientific data, knowledges to develop this area? Because these countries, as global south face, as other areas, are still colonial and still depend on the Western ideas, but they are lack of exploring their own identities, their own ways and means of who we are.
I think there's been a travesty. I think what you find in global south countries is this, I would say in the global south countries, what you find is this fascination, almost a fetish for Western concepts, Western academia.
Yeah.
And I'm very aware of that. It's almost like an academic colonialism that we must learn from, we must learn from particular theories or approaches, but they don't connect to the global south sometimes.
Yeah.
We need to think about understanding. In my role, or the way I look at it, is facilitating you, your department, the university, to think about masculinity, to think about gender in your own indigenous way.
Yeah.
To facilitate that,
Yeah.
to have confidence and strength to develop your own studies. Now, because then my role really is to facilitate, to support, to move you forward in developing your own theories and your own ideas. So you're less dependent on what happens in London or New York. What happens in Colombo? What happens in Kelaniya? What happens in Kandy?
Yeah.
That's what we need to be looking at.
Yeah.
How can we take what we already know and work through and help us understand what is happening in those local contexts? That is really, really so important.
Thank you very much. During my doctoral training, that what he wanted to do is that don't depend on Western frames, because Western knowledge is already created in these areas. Why don't you look at your own country, your own society, your own ways and means of how people behave? This is very interesting. That's why we invite Chris to this media program. And Chris, you are very important for us and our country. On behalf of our country, we should be thankful to you, because you are now engaging to study our local education, especially in Sri Lanka. Last couple of decades, more men are decreasing in the higher education. Being Chris' first expertise in education, and after that the sex and romances through the masculinity, why do you think this is one of the interesting area according to your present research scaling?
Well, in the global south countries tend to you tend to see a lot more men going to university, more generally, okay? And there are exceptions to that.
Yeah.
And one of the exceptions to that global south trend is Sri Lanka.
Isn't it?
So in Sri Lanka,
Yeah.
you will find more women going to university than men. Why is that? What are the reasons for that? So in Tanzania, for example, you will find more men go to university and the women stay at home in the domestic sphere. In Sri Lanka, it's inverted. Yeah, so more men are not going to university, but staying maybe with a family business, for example.
Yeah.
So I'm really intrigued and excited to be thinking through, well, why is that the case? Why is it declining? Why is it happening? Because we have the trends, we have the statistics about where, what subjects, etc., where it's happening. But we need to explain it. We need to say, well, why is that? Because if that's becoming a problem for Sri Lankan society, we need to identify why it's a problem and how we solve it.
All right. Thank you very much. Now, the Newcastle University UK and University of Kelaniya with the National Education Ministry, Higher Education Ministry, Chris, instrumental to operate a new research, and within next year 31st of March we will finish our pilot research, on which data we are going to make a national conference on higher education, and on that Chris is supporting us immensely. His willing is to develop a massive research on changing curricula in terms of the new society that is requested by the young and their rebellions. We are talking about sex research openly because tomorrow we are going to deliver a very good, interesting research on his latest research, UK sex clubs, to the social sciences faculty. Because this is very important. It's still, even though we have medical faculties in Sri Lanka and other countries, and psychology departments, social sciences, sociology, anthropology, sometimes still we are dependent on the colonial narratives of the indecency as depicted in 1883 Victorian values. Actually, in Britain, they are not accepting these things. But in global south countries like us, still are early British. So, what does sex research mean, Chris?
Some people often become curious about sex research.
It is curious.
So often they say to me, when you research sex, are you doing the sex?
Yes.
Often, but you would not have the same question asked to someone who's looking at memory.
Yeah.
Are you researching memory because you have a bad memory?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or if you're researching cancer, are you researching cancer because you have cancer yourself? Those questions don't get asked to other researchers. But when it comes to sex, people get excited.
Yeah.
And interested and curious and become suspicious. Now, in the my basis for looking at sex and sexual practices and sexual identities is in the UK, there is around 400,000 new cases of sexually transmitted infections each year. 400,000.
Yes.
That is such a high number.
Yeah.
So, and yet, after 20, 30, 40 years of sex education, we still have 400, nearly 500,000 cases of sexual infections every year. What can we do to change that? So the sex research comes in to understand why people are having intimate relations with each other, in what places, and how power works in those dynamics and notions of consent. So I'm very interested. My initial point of entry is in sexual health and how we can actually improve sexual health of young people, older people, and various minority groups.
It's very interesting now. Sex research for the ground social change on behalf of sexual health, that more men and women and children are suffering from their childhood about some of the sexual traumas, sexual issues, sexual problems that are created by social constructed pillars. In that case, Sri Lanka, still we are suffering and we are confronting a huge gap of fear and shame. How we can eradicate these cultural misconceptions through promoting more sex research? Because, you know, even though we are expecting more scientific knowledge from science faculties, medical faculties, engineering, yes, it is. But in case of social science and humanities education, how we can promote this knowledge in order to real world change, social change? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. I think, you know, what can the social sciences, what can the arts tell us about sex and sexuality?
Yeah.
It can tell us everything. It can tell us everything we need to know. We just need to look and we need to listen. Yeah. Because part of, historically, sex research has always been about doing research on people, Let's find out how they work
Yep.
or what happens with the body.
Yeah.
Social science research, sociology, cultural studies, focuses on exploring why people do it, how people feel. Why do they do risky sexual practices? Why? Unless you ask your question, you won't find out. So one of the ways of tackling, addressing, developing interventions is to understand why things are happening in a particular way. Why is it sexual violence takes place, but no one talks about it? Why don't people talk about it? So part of that sex research is to understand why, the reasons for that, to understand and explain why that's taken place. Because once we know why and how, we can develop interventions to make it better.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. Sex research, sometimes more science studies in our countries or medical studies are much devoted to heterosexual relationships. Still, even I see some, even in the States or UK, have some homophobic attitudes on openly discussing in public settings about non-heterosexual relationships, what we mean by LGBT studies. Why this LGBT studies is so prominent now in a digital, social, democratic, neoliberal context?
Well, I think one of the we always talk about the bad things of social media. They're so bad. There's too many people spending too much time, fake news, AI. We talk about the bad things of social media. One of the positive things on social media is that it gives people voices. It enables people to talk about things that maybe they have not been able to talk about in other spaces. Maybe in schools, it's very difficult to talk about your own personal sexuality in schools. At work, who would be discussing sexuality at work? So the social media has enabled people to have conversations. It's enabled people to take away some of that shame, some of that stigma, some of that embarrassment. Okay? Don't get me wrong, social media has lots of faults and can be, in my own daughter, spends too much screen time.
Yeah.
But for certain groups, that social media, that digital platform can enable people to support them, to take away the mental stresses and pressures.
Yeah.
It enables people to become more healthy in terms of how they're able to talk and express themselves.
Yeah.
So yes, I think social media has enabled particular groups to talk more, to become more visible, to get the knowledge out there.
Yeah, that's more important. Chris is more has experiences on sex clubs and other sex research more in the physical sources society, but he has done lots of supervisions of his students, postgraduate, on how sex shift to the virtual or digital platforms. Why modern day lots of people are using social media or digital platform to gratify their sexual needs?
I think, historically we've had a trend about meeting people and having sexual relations. You had, historically in the UK, there's been this kind of dating or courtship. Maybe there's something that would lead
Dating
to
apps.
marriage. Yeah.
Dating apps.
Yeah, and so more recently, the dating apps have enabled that to accelerate.
Yeah.
So we have an acceleration of meeting people. Yeah, we have the ability to meet people, not just who we work with, who we share the neighborhood with, but we can start relationships from thousands of miles away because of the dating apps.
Yeah.
So there's an acceleration, there's a compression of time and space. There's many things that the dating app is doing around intimacy that we are just trying to work out to make sense of.
Yeah. That gives some chances to even we have to talk for the real world amendments, not only the social amendment, but the countries like us are still depending on the colonial constitutions and laws and regulations, so that, for an example, Sri Lankan LGBT communities are struggling through the legal amendments for their sexual citizenships. Chris, do you see any positive updates or positive chances that by social media is more using by young generations, and the global south countries like Sri Lanka is asking for more sexual liberations from their governments. So do you see any chances that while social media use sexual liberations and sexual citizenship, do you see any interplay with these areas in terms of your research?
I think in terms of specifically around Sri Lanka, I mean, the new government has seen the way in which societies can come together and challenge injustices and corruption. Then I see great potential for Sri Lankan young people to mobilize across digital platforms to make change. It's there. Now you have the basis to move forward and not just change governments, change ways of thinking, change other forms of social injustice that are that may exist in society. Injustices around lesbian, gay couples, marriage. We've seen it in other countries. We've seen it in India. Surely there is a space now to open up within Sri Lanka if Sri Lankan people want that to develop and move forward.
Thank you very much. Actually, the research for the ground social change, not only for the academic sophistications or offering degrees or that. That's what we learn from the so-called developed countries and how their education system are so updated. That is what we are expecting through our young generation's struggles and liberations. So we wish that the scholars like Chris Haywood, who are the world-leading expert in certain areas, we can take their support to develop our Sri Lankan universities, new researchers in social sciences, not only the social sciences, but also natural sciences. Thank you very much, Chris, being participated with our channels. And we hope you will give our maximum support to encourage and develop these areas.
I'm so grateful for the opportunity to come to such a beautiful country in Sri Lanka with beautiful people. It's been a pleasure, it's an honor, and it's certainly a privilege to be and work with you.
Thank you very much, Chris Haywood, Newcastle University, British government and Sri Lanka, and the University of Kelaniya. Thank you very much.